August 15th, 1945. The sirens stopped. For the first time in months, the sky was empty. In a cramped wooden house on the outskirts of Tokyo, a mother sat alone by the radio, clutching a photograph. Her son, 19 years old, Kamikaze pilot. He had flown out 6 days ago. She was about to hear a word she never thought the emperor would say: surrender. This video isn't about generals or emperors. It's about what ordinary Japanese civilians said, felt, and did in the moment their world collapsed. Noon. Silence. No B-29 seconds overhead. No sirens wailing. Just heat. Suffocating. August heat. Families sat in their homes waiting for something. Anything. The radio had announced it that morning. Stand by for an important broadcast at noon. The emperor himself would speak. The emperor, a living god who had never spoken directly to his people. Not once in 2,600 years of imperial history. In one schoolyard, girls in sailor uniforms had been practicing that morning, thrusting bamboo poles into sandbags while their teacher shouted, "Imagine the American's chest." On a windy coastline, an old man with arthritic hands kept shoveling dirt into a trench, telling himself that if he dug deep enough, maybe his grandchildren would live. Children asked questions their parents couldn't answer. Why is the emperor speaking? Is this the final order? Will we die today? The streets remained empty. Nobody knew what was coming, but everyone felt it. Something was ending. Noon. Families gathered around radios, in homes, in factories, in town squares. The static crackled. Then, a voice, high-pitched, distant, like it was coming from another world. The emperor spoke in archaic court Japanese. Words almost nobody could understand. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. People leaned closer to the speakers. What did he say? What does that mean? We have resolved to endure the unendurable and suffer the insufferable. Endure what? Suffer what? Old women began to cry. They didn't understand the words, but they understood the tone. Then the broadcast ended. Silence. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the announcer returned, speaking plainly this time. Japan has accepted the terms of surrender. The war is over. One man later wrote, "I felt the ground disappear beneath my feet." Some people collapsed. Others just stared at the radio, unable to process what they'd heard. Children asked, "Did we win?" And parents had to say the word they'd been forbidden to speak for years. "No, we lost." The radio said victory was certain. The newspapers said it. The government said it. 100 million deaths for the emperor. That was the slogan chanted in school assemblies, painted on factory walls, whispered in prayer. Every civilian had been trained to fight. Every single one. Schoolgirls practiced with bamboo spears in the summer sun, their hands blistering as they thrust at imaginary enemies. Elderly men dug trenches along the beaches, their backs screaming in pain, convinced that every shovelful of dirt might save a grandchild. The message was clear. The Americans will invade, and when they do, we die fighting. Honorable death, not shameful surrender. But now, surrender? The divine wind that was supposed to protect Japan? Gone. The invincible spirit of the Yamato race? A lie. The promise of victory? Dust. One teacher said, "It felt like waking up from a fever dream and realizing the dream was all we had." But the confusion was just the beginning, because within hours, a new terror took hold. The whispers started immediately. Neighbor to neighbor, parent to child. The Americans are coming. And for years, Japanese civilians had been told exactly what Americans do. The propaganda was explicit, horrifying, inescapable. They will enslave you. They will torture you. They will rape your women and murder your children. Posters showed American soldiers as demons with fangs dripping blood. Films depicted them as savages without honor or mercy. And now those demons were landing on Japanese soil. Families made terrible decisions. Some fled to the mountains with nothing but rice and fear. Others prepared for something darker, family suicide pacts. The military had distributed instructions months earlier. If the Americans come, take your own life. Die with dignity. Mothers hid their daughters in attics and cellars. Some cut their hair, dressed them as boys. One mother shaved her daughter's head completely and rubbed dirt on her face, whispering, "Stay ugly, stay alive." Men burned their uniforms in kitchen stoves, destroyed medals, smashed framed photos of themselves in military dress, erased any connection to the defeated army. Why? Because nobody knew what the conquerors would do. One woman remembered, We heard the Americans had landed in Yokohama. My mother gave me a kitchen knife. She said, "If they come for you, don't let them take you alive. Cut here." She pointed to her throat. This was the reality. A nation of 70 million people waiting for the end. But one mother's story would reveal the deepest wound. Her name was Reiko, 43 years old. Widow. She lived in a small house outside Yokohama, and she still kept her son's school uniform folded in a drawer, even though he'd left 6 months ago. His name was Hiroshi. He was 19. He had volunteered in February, not as a regular soldier. As a kamikaze pilot, Reiko had begged him not to go. She'd grabbed his sleeve at the train station and said, "You're my only son. If you die, I have nothing." But Hiroshi said what so many young men said. "If I don't go, who will protect Japan? Who will protect you?" She watched him leave, watched him bow to her one last time. He promised he would die with honor, and she believed him. Because what else could she do? On August 16th, one day after the Emperor's broadcast, a military officer knocked on her door. He handed her a piece of paper, official notification of death. Hiroshi's plane had crashed into the Pacific Ocean on August 12th, 3 days before the surrender. Reiko read the date, then read it again, August 12th, 3 days. The officer bowed and turned to leave, but before he could go, Reiko spoke. Her voice was quiet, hollow. "He died 3 days early." The officer stopped. He didn't turn around. Reiko continued, staring at the paper in her hands. If he had waited 3 days, he would have come home. Then she said the words that would replay in that officer's mind for the rest of his life. He died for nothing. Not for Japan. Not for honor. Not for the Emperor. For nothing. That single sentence captured what millions of Japanese mothers felt. Sons, brothers, husbands, gone. And for what? A lost war. A broken promise. A leader who had lied. But the cruelest shock was still to come. The Americans landed in late August. Troops poured into Tokyo, Yokohama, Osaka. Japanese civilians watched from broken windows, expecting violence, chaos, the horrors they'd been warned about for years. But what arrived was different. American soldiers handed out rations from the backs of trucks, chocolate bars, chewing gum, canned meat. They smiled at children, helped elderly women clear rubble from the streets, set up field hospitals for the wounded. One girl remembered, "A tall soldier with red hair gave me chocolate. I thought it was poison, but I was so hungry, I ate it anyway. It was the sweetest thing I'd ever tasted, and I hated myself for thinking that. The devils were polite, organized, even kind, and that was somehow worse, because it meant everything they'd been told was a lie. The enemy wasn't a monster, which meant, what did that make Japan? Families sat in silence trying to process the contradiction. We were supposed to die fighting these people, but they're giving us food. We were told they were savages, but they're rebuilding our schools. We were promised they would destroy us, but they're handing out medicine. One man wrote in his diary, "I prepared to kill my family with my own hands to save them from American brutality. Now that same American is teaching my son how to play baseball. I don't know who I am anymore." Cognitive dissonance spread like a disease. Some people accepted it quickly. Others denied it for years. But everyone felt it. The world they knew had ended. And the new world made no sense. Yet survival didn't wait for understanding. Food was gone. Money was worthless. Cities lay in ruins. Japanese civilians now faced a new battle. Staying alive. Women searched through rubble for anything useful. Bricks, wood, nails, fabric, anything to trade. Children stood in lines for hours, sometimes days, waiting for rice from American supply trucks. The black market exploded. People traded family heirlooms for potatoes, silk kimonos for flour, wedding rings for a handful of dried fish, dignity for survival. One woman remembered, "I sold my grandmother's jade hairpin for 3 cups of rice. She had worn it on her wedding day. My mother had worn it on hers. It had been in our family for 80 years. But my children were starving. What choice did I have?" There was a word for what the nation felt. Kyodatsu, a state of exhausted despair, spiritual collapse. The fight was over. But the suffering had just begun. Winters were brutal. No heat, no shelter, no hope. Families crowded into bombed-out buildings, sleeping under tarps, burning books for warmth. Disease spread quickly. Tuberculosis, dysentery, starvation. Thousands who survived the bombs didn't survive the peace. And through it all, one question kept surfacing. How did we get here? In 1946, something happened that shattered what remained of the old story. newsreels arrived. Not Japanese newsreels, American ones. Civilians were invited, sometimes forced to attend screenings in makeshift theaters and school halls. They expected propaganda, victory footage, Americans celebrating. But what they saw was different. Footage of villages in China and Korea, Japanese soldiers marching through streets, prisoners kneeling in rows, bodies in ditches. The camera didn't look away. One woman walked out before the film ended. She stood in the alley behind the theater, shaking. A friend asked her what was wrong. She said, "I thought we were only defending ourselves. I thought we were the victims. No one told us we did this too." This was the second collapse. First, they learned they'd lost the war. Now, they learned what the war had actually been. Not a noble defense, not a sacred mission, something darker. Some people refused to watch. Others watched in silence, then never spoke of it again. But a few, just a few, began to ask the question that would haunt Japan for generations. Did we know? Did we really not know? Or did we just choose not to see? It took years. Some Japanese accepted responsibility quickly. They helped rebuild. They faced the truth. They educated their children about what really happened. But others never accepted it. They blamed the bombs. They blamed the Allies. They blamed fate. They said, "We were victims too." And in some ways, they were. Japanese civilians did suffer. They lost homes, families, futures. Children burned alive in firebombs, cities erased in nuclear light. But they were also part of a system that caused unimaginable harm across Asia. Holding both truths at once was almost impossible. Yet it was necessary. Communities fractured, neighbor against neighbor. You supported the war. You wore the uniform. You cheered when we invaded Manchuria. People who had lived side by side for decades suddenly became strangers. Some families discovered their neighbors had been military police, local enforcers, informants who turned in defeatists to the Kempeitai, and now those people were being judged. But the deeper question remained, who was guilty? The leaders? The soldiers? Or everyone who stayed silent? One schoolteacher said, "We didn't know the full truth, but we knew something was wrong. We saw the photographs in the newspapers. We heard the rumors. We just didn't ask questions." And not asking, that was a choice too. This admission haunted many. The idea that they could have known, should have known, but chose not to look. By the 1950 seconds, a new generation was born. Children who didn't remember the war. Children who asked their parents hard questions. What did you do? What did you know? Why didn't you stop it? And most parents stayed silent, because some truths are too painful to speak. Slowly, painfully, Japan began to change. Not perfectly, not completely, but it began. In 1989, a journalist found Reiko, the mother whose son had died 3 days before surrender. She was 87 years old, living in a small apartment in Osaka. The journalist asked if she regretted letting her son volunteer. Reiko looked at Hiroshi's faded photograph on the wall, the one taken before he left, him smiling in his flight suit. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "He believed he was dying for something holy. I believed it too." She paused. "Now I think, we both died that day. He died in the ocean. I died when I realized it was all a lie." The journalist asked one more question. "What would you say to young people today?" Reiko stared out the window. "When your leaders speak with absolute certainty about enemies and necessary sacrifices, when they tell you that questioning is betrayal, that's when you must question the most." She turned back to the journalist. "Because silence killed more of us than any bomb." So what did Japanese civilians really say when the war ended? Many things. Some said, "Thank the gods, it's over." Others said, "We didn't know." Some said, "We were just following orders." And a few whispered, "We should have asked more questions." One elderly man, interviewed in 1975, said, "We wanted to believe our leaders. We wanted to believe we were righteous. Admitting we were wrong meant admitting we wasted years of our lives and our children's lives on a lie. That's harder than any bomb." Here's the question this leaves us with. When you hear someone say, "We didn't know," how much do you believe them? Is ignorance an excuse or just another way of saying, "I chose not to see"? And if your own leaders, today, spoke with the same certainty about enemies and necessary sacrifices, would you react any differently than they did in 1945? Because history shows us one thing clearly. Silence can be just as dangerous as action. And that's a truth every generation must remember.